I was born and raised on a cattle ranch just north of Gillette, Wyoming. When I would fly home from college, I had the choice of two airports, Rapid City, South Dakota, or Denver, Colorado. Rapid City was best if you could find a ticket for the right price because then it was only a 2-hour drive home instead of 6. As a homesick college student, I would crave that moment when I would cross the state line into Wyoming. And there was a particular feeling that I was looking for, and it's a feeling that I would describe as wildness. When I-90 first crosses the state line, you drive past a town, if you can call it that, called Beulah, the sign of the bucking horse and his rider saying, "Welcome to Wyoming, forever west." And you crash into this rolling expanse of hills and plains with barely a house or a town in sight, and the sky opens up in front of you and it's limitless. It's like you're looking into eternity. And once you drive through Sundance, the town with the famous jail that gave the Sundance Kid its name, there's a particular landmark far to the right of the highway that lets you know it's about an hour drive till home. Devil's Tower, an isolated tower of igneous rock originating from lava and magma, the largest of its kind in the world, looms in the distance. It's like its own lonely mountain. A Sioux legend tells of two young boys headed home only to realize they are being pursued by a mato, a Herculean-sized bear. The boys ran from the mato as long as they could, but there was no safe place to hide in the low brush and the plains. Desperate, the boys knelt on the rock and prayed to the Great Spirit to save them. The earth began to shake, and the rock grew, lifting the boys to the sky. The enraged mato clawed every side of the rock to get to the boys, leaving deep striations in the stone. But he could not overcome the Great Spirit, and soon he left, unable to harm the boys. The boys were carried home on a wanbli, a giant eagle sent to rescue them. Wildness. It's wildness and safety. Less than an hour from home. The 80-mile-an-hour speed limits never seemed to be fast enough. I was always tired, 22 upper-level credit hours, a full-time job, training for marathons. I was always struggling to stay awake. Eventually, with music blasting and windows down, I'd catch the sight of a small belch of smoke. Wyadak Power Plant, a beige, almost Cold War-looking structure responsible for generating electricity for 5 states. Wyadak meant I was 10 minutes from home, at least how I drove back then. Exit 126 takes you to Highway 59 North, and I'd see one last landmark before my family's ranch opened up across my windshield. A cluster of dreary gray columns next to the train tracks, as much a symbol of Wyoming as the horse and the rider. A coal mine. Rawhide coal mine, to be exact. The same mine I saw every time we went to town and every time I came home. If I was lucky to get back before sunset, I would rush to the top of the ranch and watch the sun sink behind the tops of the Tetons. Real mountains. Not the hills on the East Coast. It's just Wyoming. The land stretches out in front of you. Civilization is few and far between. It's tumbleweeds, plains, pines, and mountains, all saying, "Thou shalt not tame me." I lived for that feeling, and honestly, I still do. That feeling actually motivates a lot of my marching to my own drum lifestyle and the decisions that I've made as an adult. Even though I prefer big cities now, I still remember that feeling. I still look for it. I still look for those untamed things. I tend to withdraw from things that feel too polished, too perfect. And I've never felt like I fit in Wyoming necessarily, but you didn't have to. Wyoming is really about staking a claim and deciding what's yours. Wyoming was and is a symbol of the West, and it is wild. But like any place, it can also be cruel and murderous. Like many rural areas, old ideas and prejudices die hard. And this was really true in the senseless and brutal murder of Matthew Shepard. On the night of October 6, 1998, Shepard, an openly gay student, was lured from a bar by two men, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, who also pretended to be gay. They drove him to a remote area, beat him severely, tied him to a fence, and left him to die in the cold. Shepard was discovered 18 hours later by a cyclist and succumbed to his injuries on October 12th. The men had pistol whipped him so badly they crushed his brainstem. His parents identified him by his dental braces. His genitals had also been beaten and crushed. His death brought widespread attention to hate crimes against the LGBTQ+ community and eventually led to the passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act in 2009. The act expanded the federal definition of hate crimes to include those motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. And this is such a sad story with such beautiful tendrils of hope. It's the hope that something great can come out of something truly horrific. But also the fact that we can choose to be better. We can choose to grow. We can evolve. We can maybe love each other a little better. Let's take a trip to my home state of Wyoming on today's Wild West edition of Highway to Hell. Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hell, the travel and true crime podcast. I'm your host, Monty Mater, rock vocalist, fitness geek, and indefinitely curious little monster. Working on this episode reminded me that I hope I always stay curious and compassionate to people around me. I actually have the word curious tattooed on my left wrist because I want to always be challenging myself to learn and expand my worldview. This reminded me so much of that. I originally had written an entirely different script for this episode. 1800 serial killer, but it's Pride Month. I remembered this case and I couldn't get it out of my mind. I just couldn't stop thinking about it because I thought about, I can do it next week, or I could do a different city, or I could do, and I was like, no. I think my gut instinct is telling me I need to talk about this. So this is what I'm doing. And I think that this story really, again, gives us a chance for some beautiful hope, even in dark places, dark times. Also, just a little announcement that Highway to Hell is going to come out on Wednesdays now. It ended up being Wednesday last week because of technical difficulties. And I realized, I'm like, wow, this is so much easier for my work schedule and my life and my multiple jobs. And so we're going to do Wednesdays from now on. So just now, to just be excited for Wednesday mornings. Yay. And because many people don't know much about Wyoming, I'm going to do a brief history of the state of Wyoming because I'm sure a lot of you don't know anything about it. And if I wasn't born there, I probably wouldn't either. And then I'm going to discuss the life, death, and the aftermath of Matthew Shepard. I hope you find this story as interesting and hope-inspiring as I did. We're going to hit the road after one quick announcement. Again, please follow on social media, Highway to Hell Pod. That's where I'm really going to focus a lot of my time and energy, extra little tidbits. A lot of that's coming out this week. I've been meeting with a videographer to go over that. So run over there. Please give that a follow. I would also prefer messages come through Instagram. It's just more accessible than me having to sign into 4 different emails. So yeah, follow me over there or follow my personal account and send me a note. It's fine. Let's jump on the road. Let's go to ancient history in the Wyoming region. Paleo Indians were the earliest known inhabitants of Wyoming and lived in the region as early as 12,000 years ago. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers who followed large game animals like mammoths and bison. Archaeological sites such as Hell Gap and Colby provide evidence of their presence. Following the Paleo Indians, we move into the Archaic period, which is about 2,000 to 8,000 years ago. People adapted to the changing environmental conditions by broadening their diet to include a variety of plants and smaller animals. They used a more diverse range of tools and created stone circles, possibly used for ceremonial purposes or as teepee foundations. And we'll talk about some of these stone circles later. From around 2,000 years ago until European contact, various Native American cultures thrived in Wyoming. These included the ancestors of what we would now know as the Shoshone, Crow, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes. They engaged in hunting, gathering, and in some areas, agriculture. The introduction of the bow and arrow around 1,500 years ago significantly improved hunting efficiency. So within Wyoming, there's major cultural groups. One of them is the Plains and Rocky Mountain cultures. Wyoming's geography, which includes both Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, supported diverse cultures, and this is reflected in the Native American tribes. Plains groups such as the Cheyenne and Arapaho were primarily bison hunters, while groups in the mountainous regions like the Shoshone had more varied subsistence strategies like fishing, hunting, and gathering. One of the most prominent groups in Wyoming, the Shoshone, are also known as the Snake Indians by later white settlers, were skilled hunters and gatherers. They utilized the rich resources of the region and were famous for their expertise in horsemanship after the introduction of horses by Europeans. The Crow were also another significant tribe in northern Wyoming. They were known for elaborate trade networks which extended across the plains and into the Rocky Mountains. The Crow were also adept horsemen and hunters. And there's still a large presence of archaeological sites to these tribes and obviously the descendants of those tribes. My best friend growing up was half Arapaho. Natives throughout Wyoming, numerous examples of rock art have been discovered, including petroglyphs and pictographs. These artwork provide insights into the spiritual and everyday lives of the region's ancient inhabitants. Wyoming is also home to what's called a medicine wheel, including the famous Bighorn medicine wheel. Now, these wheels are clusters of stones. It's a wheel outside of a cluster in the center, and there's 4 spokes stretching from the center to the outer. We had actually 2 or 3 of these on the ranch I grew up on. Big medicine wheels. The 4 sections represent several different things. They can represent the 4 directions, the seasons of life, or the aspects of being human: physical, spiritual, emotional, and intellectual. While medicine wheels can be decorative pieces or jewelry, in Wyoming, the wheels were actually built into the land, very large size, made of stones and arranged in a wheel pattern. They're believed to have been used for astronomical, ceremonial, and calendrical purposes. Really, really beautiful. It's really, I love this kind of history, and there's just not enough of it in the world, but medicine wheels are pretty frequent across Wyoming. Wyoming was part of an extensive trade network. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used for making tools, was traded across vast distances, and archaeological evidence shows that goods such as shell beads, pottery, and turquoise traveled throughout these networks as well. It wasn't until between 1807 and 1808 that John Coulter, a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, is believed to be one of the first Europeans to actually explore the regions. His reports of geothermal activity eventually drew attention to the area that we now know as Yellowstone National Park. Between the 1840s and the 1860s, the Oregon Trail, which was a major route westward for migration, passed through Wyoming, bringing thousands of settlers to the region. The Oregon Trail was a historic east-to-west route that stretched about 2,170 miles from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon in the United States. It was used primarily during the mid-19th century by pioneers traveling to the fertile lands of the Willamette Valley. Primarily seeking new opportunities in the West, it included farmers, miners, ranchers, and businessmen. Pioneers braved varied and difficult terrains by foot, horse, and wagon that included prairies, deserts, and mountains. There was an extensive amount of death by disease, such as cholera, and if you played the Oregon Trail game, dysentery. Did anyone in the Oregon Trail game ever die of anything but dysentery? I feel like I played that game for a year straight when I was in middle school, and I always died of dysentery. I never made it to Willamette Valley. Also, along the actual Oregon Trail, supplies were hard to maintain, and certain Native American tribes were very friendly and welcoming, and some were very deadly. The travelers of the Oregon Trail began to establish settlements in Wyoming, and the discovery of gold in the South Pass region in the 1860s attracted miners and settlers, leading to the establishment of towns like South Pass City. But it wasn't until July 25th of 1868 that the Wyoming Territory was officially established by the U.S. Congress. It was carved out of portions of the Dakota, Utah, and Idaho territories, all being part of the larger Louisiana Purchase. The early economy was based on mining, particularly gold, and later on cattle ranching, as the vast open plains proved ideal for grazing, and honestly, they still are. The Union Pacific Railroad, completed in 1869, brought in more settlers and goods to the region, fostering economic growth and development. A super interesting little historical factoid about Wyoming I wanted to include is the history of women's suffrage in Wyoming. Wyoming made history by becoming the first U.S. territory to grant women the right to vote. At the time, this was a bold and extremely progressive move. This was still in the 1800s, primarily motivated by the hope of attracting more settlers, mainly women, to the sparsely populated territory. They had a lot of dudes. They needed more women. So they're like, you know what? we're going to let women help make the decisions. And sure enough, women showed up. It worked. December 10th, 1869, the Wyoming Territorial Legislature passed the suffrage bill, which was signed into law by Governor John A. Campbell. This law not only granted women the right to vote, but also allowed them to hold public office. This was also a first in the U.S. Yeah, go Wyoming. In 1870, Esther Hobart Morris became the first female justice of the peace in the United States, appointed in South Pass City. Despite some opposition and attempts to repeal the law, Wyoming maintained its commitment to women's suffrage. This progressive stance on gender equality became a significant part of the territory's identity, and which is why the nickname for Wyoming is the Equality State. It was the very first state to support women's suffrage, long before women were federally able to vote in 1920. July 10th, 1890, Wyoming was admitted to the Union as the 44th state. Its constitution retained the right to vote for women, making Wyoming the first state where women had full suffrage. Again, it wasn't until 1920 that was available nationally. And also gave the U.S. their first female governor in 1924, Nellie Taylor Ross. In the early 20th century, there was continued growth in agriculture, particularly cattle and sheep ranching. I grew up on a cattle ranch. Most of my family are ranchers. The discovery of oil and natural gas further boosted the economy. Wyoming is a wealth of natural resources and is the number one exporter of energy in the U.S. We have just as many antelope as people, but it is the number one exporter of energy and supplies several states with power. There's 5 states that it almost exclusively supplies their power. In the 1910s to the 1920s, we saw the development of national parks, including Yellowstone, which was established in 1872 before statehood, and Grand Teton National Park. These promoted tourism and conservation efforts. Today, Wyoming's economy is driven by mineral extraction, so again, natural gas, coal, tourism, and agriculture. The state remains sparsely populated, but rich in natural beauty and resources. You can literally drive for a couple hours and not see a house. Like, that's an actual, I'm not making a joke, that's a real thing. It can get spicy if your car breaks down, let's put it that way. As of the latest estimates, Wyoming has a population of approximately 580,000 people, so less than 1 million in the whole state, making it the least populous state in the U.S. So let me point out that Alaska has more people than we do. North Dakota does, which is kind of embarrassing, but it's fine. Despite its small population, Wyoming plays a significant role in several major industries and, again, the export of electricity. It's a powerhouse of a state. It just doesn't really have humans. Anyways. Tourism is another vital industry in Wyoming, drawing millions of visitors each year to its national parks and natural attractions. Yellowstone National Park is renowned for its geothermal features, including the iconic Old Faithful Geyser. And also the hot springs there are incredible. They are so beautiful and so damn dangerous. Anyways, Grand Teton National Park is stunning, beautiful mountain landscapes, diverse wildlife, and it also attracts outdoor enthusiasts, so campers, hikers, fishing, skiing, canoes, snowmobiling, outdoorsy people. This is the episode for you. Family vacation in a van people, this is the episode for you. And of course, with the state sport being rodeo, agriculture remains an important sector in Wyoming, with cattle and sheep ranching being the most prevalent. The state's vast rangelands are well suited for grazing, not so much for farming, and Wyoming beef is highly regarded for its quality, and it is delicious. Delicious. Wyoming remains famous for its rugged individualism and that cowboy culture. Can't tell you how many times growing up I heard cowboy up or like different spins of that. And there's the phrase that the world needs more cowboys, things like that. A lot of this culture is celebrated annually at events such as Cheyenne Frontier Days, which is the largest outdoor rodeo and music festival of its kind. It's a 10-day celebration every summer held in the state capital of Cheyenne. And we'll talk more about that in the travel portion because it is well worth seeing. I'm actually hoping to go either this year or next year because I haven't been in several years. Now let's talk a little bit of crime. Regarding safety, Wyoming, as a general rule, has a low murder rate compared to other states. It's typically 2 to 3 murders per 100,000 people. This low rate contributes to Wyoming's reputation of being a safe and peaceful place to live. However, Wyoming faces different challenges related to drug abuse and suicide. particularly among teens and young adults. Wyoming has experienced a troubling rise in substance abuse, including opioids, methamphetamines, and alcohol addiction. The opioid crisis, which affected a lot of the U.S., has taken a toll on Wyoming. Wyoming is actually one of the highest states of substance abuse in the country. Prescription drug misuse and the availability of illicit opioids have contributed to an increase in addiction and overdose deaths, and methamphetamine use is extremely common. There was actually, so on the front of my family's ranch, there was houses that my dad would rent out as rental houses. People would rent property. And I remember, I think I was 14, and there was a guy who rented a house. He was super nice. I didn't really know him, but every time we saw him, he was nice. He was friendly. We started noticing that like high school kids were coming on and off the ranch to his house a lot. We're like, that's weird, strange. And eventually what ended up happening, the cops show up. The man had a meth lab in the house, and the high schoolers were his drug mules. So that's fun. Among teenagers, the misuse of prescription medications, marijuana, and alcohol is particularly concerning. I'd be more concerned with the alcohol than the marijuana, to be fair. Surveys and studies indicate that Wyoming teens experiment with these substances at rates much higher than the national average, and a lot of researchers believe that the issues contributing to this is the easy access to drugs. There's a lack of awareness. There's not as much extensive education, both drug education and sex education in Wyoming. And there's insufficient prevention and intervention programs, and a big one, and a lot of research agrees on this, there's nothing to fucking do. These poor kids are out there, and I mean, snow starts in October and will last until maybe May. It's cold, it's dark, a lot of these towns are small. There's not rec centers, there's not after school programs in a lot of areas. Literally, these kids have nothing to do. Nothing. And granted, a lot of kids live on their family's ranch and they work and stuff, but a lot of them don't have anything to do. If you live in a small town, there is nothing for you to do but get in trouble. And so they think that this is actually a huge contributor to teen and young adult substance abuse. Wyoming also has one of the highest suicides rates in the country, 25.6 per 100,000, in contrast to the national average of 14 per 100,000. The only states with higher suicide rates are Montana and Alaska. The issue is especially acute among teens and young adults. Suicide rates for teens ages 14 to 19 are double the national average and almost double for 20 to 24-year-olds. The most common method of suicide is the firearm. The state's vast rural areas contribute to social isolation. People are lonely. Again, there's nothing to do. They have these exacerbated feelings of loneliness and depression. There's still a stigma surrounding mental health issues and therapy. A lot of individuals don't feel comfortable seeking help. And even if they do, there are not a lot of qualified psychologists and psychiatrists to treat those problems. Thank God for apps like BetterHelp now that are doing all of this online so people everywhere can get help. And a big one with the suicide rate, easy access to firearms. Lock your guns up, people. Lock them up. Everyone in Wyoming has a gun. It's one of those states. And the issue is that some people do not take proper care of those things to make sure it doesn't get in the hands of people that it shouldn't. So now that we have a brief history of Wyoming, you know a little bit about my home state, how it came to be, its history with women's suffrage, and its current problems. Let's talk about the life, death, and the aftermath of the murder of Matthew Shepard. And this is the least intrusive space to have my mid-show sponsor break. So it's a little early in the show, but I'm going to do it right now so we can really just sit in the story. This episode is brought to you by Intravenous Solutions, Nashville's premier IV therapy and wellness center. IV therapy can help you recover quicker from heavy workouts or illness, treat the symptoms of dehydration, and improve your sleep and give you healthy, glowing skin. Being on stage several times a week, personal training sessions every week, my own training to do Spartan races, I can say that IV treatments keep me on my feet and are a lifesaver. Dr. Allen and his staff are so kind and so knowledgeable. They make sure that every appointment is welcoming and easy. They offer vitamin shots, oxygen therapy, Botox, fillers, weight management, and even mobile services. They have 4 locations in Nashville, Hendersonville, Franklin, and their brand new location on 2nd Avenue in the Bankers Alley Hotel by Hilton. It's easy to get high quality care all week. Come party in Nashville. Come visit me. Go beat the hangover at Intravenous Solutions. Give the code Monty10 at checkout for a 10% discount on your services. Now let's time travel back to 1998. I personally believe that humanity peaked in the 90s, but hopefully we can get some of that back. I'm such a big fan of the music and the fashion and the history, and even kind of the general angst of the 90s I find very relatable. 1998 in particular was a vibrant year for pop culture. Blockbuster hits like The Titanic continued its reign from 1997, with new hits like Saving Private Ryan and Armageddon hitting theaters. In music, the Billboard charts exploded with catchy pop tunes such as The Boy Is Mine by Brandy and Monica, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing by Aerosmith, which was featured in Armageddon, and Britney Spears burst onto the scene with her debut single, Baby One More Time. It was signaling the start of the teen pop era. Backstreet's back, all right. That was my first CD. I'm gonna let you know that. I'm gonna tell you right now. My dad gave me money. He let me buy a CD. It was Backstreet Boys. On television, Sex and the City premiered, quickly becoming a cultural phenomenon. And then, President Bill Clinton's affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky came to light, leading to a scandal that resulted in his impeachment by the House of Representatives later in the year. Additionally, the world mourned the death of Frank Sinatra, one of the world's greatest entertainers in the 20th century. In the 1990s, gay culture in the United States saw significant visibility and transformation, marked by both progress and some challenges. The decade began in the shadow of the AIDS crisis of the 80s, which had a devastating impact on the gay community. But it also galvanized activism and awareness. Groups like ACT UP and events such as the annual AIDS Walk played crucial roles in advocating for research and treatment. Television and film began to portray gay characters more openly and much more sympathetically in shows like Will and Grace and Ellen. The latter, of course, Ellen DeGeneres, groundbreaking coming out both on screen and in real life. I still remember when people were freaking out about that. And as an adult, I was a kid at the time, so I didn't really understand what she was saying. I was like, coming out of what? But now as an adult, I'm like, was anyone surprised? Like, everything about her tells me that, yeah, it's like she would tell me that and be like, oh, okay, awesome. Already knew that. Anyways. However, the cultural attitude towards the LGBTQ community was still mixed. While there were strides towards acceptance and legal rights, other legislation pushed back hard on full equality, such as the 1993 Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the military, basically the military's version of Florida's current Don't Say Gay movement, and the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, which federally defined marriages between a man and a woman, reflecting the ongoing resistance to full equality. Matthew Shepard's murder highlighted the severe consequences of homophobia and became a rallying point for hate crime legislation. His mother, who essentially negotiated the death penalty off the table for her son's murderer, took her grief and decided that she would do everything in her power to make sure this never happened to someone else's child. She honestly is truly inspiring and motivational in this story. Let's dive in. Matthew Wayne Shepard was born on December 1st, 1976, in Casper, Wyoming, to parents Judy and Dennis Shepard. His father, Dennis, worked as an oil safety engineer, which required the family to move frequently, exposing Matthew to various cultures and experiences from a very young age. His mother, Judy, was a homemaker who later became an influential LGBTQ rights activist following Matthew's death. Growing up, Matthew was known for his friendly and approachable nature. In every interview I watched, every single person mentioned his smile. That he was friendly, it allowed him to make friends easily, and he always stood up for other kids. He never wanted other kids' feelings to be hurt. He never wanted people to be left out. He was constantly an advocate for people around him. He was the eldest of two sons with a younger brother named Logan. Matthew's early years were marked by a sense of adventure and curiosity influenced by his father's career, which took the family to different parts of the world, including Saudi Arabia and Europe. His parents were actually living in Saudi Arabia at the time of his attack. Matthew attended Crest Hill Elementary School in Casper, Wyoming, and later transferred to high school in Switzerland, where his family moved for his father's work. In Switzerland, Matthew attended the American School in Switzerland, abbreviated TASIS or TASIS, where he developed an interest in languages and culture, becoming fluent in both German and Italian. He was an active participant in school activities and was known for a keen interest in politics and equality, traits that would shape his advocacy in later years. This also heavily influenced Matthew's openness about his sexuality, which was less common at the time outside of major urban areas. After completing high school, Matthew returned to the United States to attend Catawba College in North Carolina and then transferred to University of Wyoming in Laramie. He majored in political science with aspirations to work in human rights. His experiences abroad and his compassionate nature influenced his worldview and his commitment to social justice. On October 6th, Matthew had met up with friends to make plans for LGBT Awareness Week on the university campus. The openly gay University of Wyoming freshman had just met up with friends to plan Awareness Week for the town's campus. After the meeting, the group went to the Village Inn, which if you're not from the area, it's like a casual dining restaurant. I would put it kind of in IHOP category. It's like IHOP meets Denny's, but a little bit nicer. It's in that space. The group got food and drinks. Matthew decided to go alone to Fireside Lounge for a nightcap before returning to campus. This ended up being a fatal mistake. At Fireside Lounge, the 21-year-old was spotted by two roofers, Russell Henderson and Aaron McKinney, who were his age. The two spotted the small 5'2" man and immediately hatched a plan. According to Detective Commander Dave O'Malley, who was the lead investigator in the case, he quoted, McKinney's own statement said that he and Russell went into the bathroom at the Fireside Bar and they planned to act like they were gay in order to gain Matthew's confidence. And so sexual orientation started right at the beginning of contact. The original intent was to pretend to be gay, gain his trust, and rob him. According to McKinney's confession, corroborated by Henderson, the two men pretended to be gay and befriended him at Fireside. The barman confirmed this interaction and identified Russell Henderson and Aaron McKinney as the men last seen with Shepard. The men offered him a ride. Sources differ whether they invited him to a party or offered to drive him back to campus. Most sources seem to agree that they offered to drive him home. According to court testimony, while driving, Matthew put his hand into McKinney's lap, reciprocating his advances that he had given him in the bar, and McKinney snapped. Evidence suggests that McKinney began sexually assaulting Matthew by hitting and squeezing Matthew's genitals while they were in the truck. Once they were at a remote location, McKinney began punching and pistol whipping Matthew with a .357 Magnum, hitting him 20 times in the head with the butt of the pistol, beating him so badly he crushed his brainstem. At McKinney's direction, Henderson helped tie the barely alive 21-year-old to a log fence with a clothesline around 11:45 p.m. They left him in the cold. It's often below freezing and with snow in Wyoming in October, and they were back in town by 12:30. The men had taken Matthew's IDs, his shoes, and their original goal, his wallet, which only contained $20. All that for $20. Sheriff O'Malley would later say that Matthew's injuries would be so horrific that, quote, the only time I've ever seen those dramatic of injuries were in high-speed traffic crashes, where there was just extremely violent compression fractures of the skull, end quote. And I gotta say something that number one, I hate bullies. I hate bullies. It is the most extreme form of cowardice to me. So not only do you have two men against one, but Matthew is 5'2". He's skinny. He's tiny. And these men just bullied up on him, just decided, we're going to take advantage of him because he's small. And more of their ideology around Matthew and his sexuality will come out later on in the story. 18 hours later, so around 6 p.m. on October 7th, the next day, a cyclist named Aaron Kreifels discovered Matthew. He initially mistook him for a scarecrow due to the extent of his injuries. He decided to stop and check. When he realized the severity of the situation, he called for help. Policewoman Reggie Flutie responded to the scene and said that Matt was then laying on his back, barely breathing. Because of his small stature, she thought he was much younger than he was. Flutie tried to clear his airway, but his mouth was clamped shut. She remembers trying to revive him, saying, baby boy, I'm here, kiddo. You're going to be okay. Hang in there. Don't give up. Come on. You can do this. And I can't imagine, at this point, she probably thinks, because he's so small, she thinks he's like 12, 13. Matthew was rushed to Ivinson Hospital in Laramie, but they would be unable to treat the extent of his injury, and he was emergency transported to Padre Valley Hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado. Here he was admitted in a coma almost a full day after the initial attack. He had been on that fence for 18 hours and managed to hang on. I don't know how he didn't die out there. Witnesses reported that Matthew's face was covered in blood except for a single tear that had cleared a path down his face. It took another 43 hours for his parents to get to him from Saudi Arabia, where they were living. Matt died 3 days later after their arrival. on October 12th, 1998. His bruising was so bad that when his parents first saw him, they could only identify him by his size and his dental braces. He passed away without ever regaining consciousness. I don't know why. The research for this and writing the script and just even telling it is really emotional. And I think for me, I have extreme prejudice towards people who are so hateful because someone doesn't look like them or doesn't believe like them or doesn't have the same. It's just heart-wrenching. And it's so, especially with this beating, I read through the coroner's report and the court documents, and it was so unbelievably brutal. And okay. Matthew's funeral was held in his hometown of Casper, Wyoming on the 16th of October in 1998, and it was marred by picketers from the worst fucking bitches in the world, Westboro Baptist Church. Reverend Fred Phelps and his congregation, that included children, held placards outside the church covered in homophobic slurs and shouted to the mourners that the dead student was burning in hell. Oh, I have so much to say about Westboro Baptist Church and how much I hope that they all get run over by vehicles the next time they protest at someone's funeral. Dennis Shepard, Matthew's father, now 69, remembers law enforcement making him wear a bulletproof vest to step outside the Episcopal Church, which had been scoured by bomb-sniffing dogs. Like, they had SWAT teams out front because everybody's worried they're going to try to blow this up. People are going to make a statement. Obviously, Westboro showed up to make a statement. And here's the thing. Like, I grew up, and I'll talk more about this later as well, but I grew up in a, like, white, very conservative, very evangelical home. I grew up with a lot of being surrounded by a lot of active and passive racism and homophobia and, you know, ideals that are not great that are held by a lot of narrow-minded conservatives. And if you use religion to justify hate and abuse and taking rights from people, imprisoning people, whatever it is, you need a new religion. Because if there is a God who is good and holy and loving, you cannot, I'm not going to curse, you cannot tell me that that is how he would want you to treat people. So either live it or just admit that you're a hateful piece of shit. My personal opinion. Anyways. His parents, who had long suspected his sexual orientation when he was young, shrugged it off when he had come out to them. His mother, Judy's friends, tease her that the giveaway should have been that his favorite Halloween costume was Dolly Parton for 3 years in a row. But Judy said that she always knew he was different. They had long supported their son. Oh, this next part. His father and his last phone exchange was simply, "I love you, Dad," and "I love you too, son." That is just like, that for me that was my last exchange with my dad before he passed away. So when I read that and I watched the interview of his dad saying that, I was like, oh my God. And it was like the day before. Even more tragically, his mother, Judy, stated that he was just putting his life together after being sexually assaulted on a high school trip to Morocco. Shepard had been gang raped by some locals. She said, "We felt like he was finally coming around to being himself again. And then this happened." Man, just people cutting onions in here. All right, let's start in on the investigation. I'm sorry for the emotions. It's just there's so much about this that is just so, to me, so tragic and so unnecessary. It is so deeply unnecessary. And I don't understand why people continue to carry this kind of hatred around with them. It's got to be exhausting. On October 7th at 12:45 a.m., long before Matthew was found, police responded to a disturbance call in a residential neighborhood. And when police arrived to the call, they came upon two men standing near a truck. And suspiciously, when police approached them, they ran in different directions. An officer was able to catch one of the men, who was later identified as Russell Henderson, and he was cited for interference with a police officer. Henderson identified the other man as his friend Aaron McKinney. Police secured the vehicle the men had been near, which belonged to Aaron's father, and looking through the windows, the police saw a jacket that was covered in blood, a very nice pair of black shoes that were small, and a bank card from a bank in Casper, Wyoming, with the name of Matthew Shepard. After obtaining a warrant, police searched the vehicle and found a massive .357 Magnum that was covered in blood to the point that hair was embedded in the wooden handle of the gun. O'Malley said it was clear something vicious had happened. It wasn't until 6:15 p.m. on October 7th that Detective O'Malley was notified that a victim had been found tied to a remote fence that matched the name of the card found in the truck. The investigative team immediately started conducting interviews to get more information, starting with Henderson, who initially invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney. In the early morning of October 8th, police were able to confirm that the shoes found in the truck did belong to Matthew Shepard, who had been left barefoot in the winter cold. Investigators began to interview the girlfriends of Henderson and McKinney on October 8th. Kristen Price, Aaron McKinney's girlfriend, and Chastity Paisley. I keep wanting to say Palsy, which I know is not a last name. Chastity Paisley, Henderson's girlfriend, provided an alibi for the two men, claiming they were with them, but police didn't buy it. The two girlfriends were arrested the same day. Detective O'Malley recalls going in to speak with Kristen and letting her know that she was an accessory after the fact of aggravated assault and attempted murder, which would later be upgraded when Matthew didn't survive. She eventually cracks and she tells the truth. She tells investigators that McKinney had come home covered in blood and said to her, "I think I've killed somebody." She also said that Russell Henderson's tennis shoes from that night had been hidden in a storage unit and provided police with the location. Police recovered the shoes and they were covered in blood. Matthew Shepard's blood. Kristen Price then gave an absolutely vital piece of evidence and said that they could find Matthew's wallet in her home. It was in a used diaper in a Walmart bag by the front door. They found the diaper, and when they opened it, Matthew's ID was right on top. Police then searched Henderson and Paisley's home and McKinney's father's truck with a search warrant. Because this was deemed as a hate crime, the FBI was called in and were able to prove that the blood on the evidence, particularly the gun, was Matthew Shepard's. The hair was identified as Matthew's as well. The gun also had Russell Henderson's DNA and a bloody fingerprint from Aaron McKinney. Now, this all happened incredibly fast. This is only 2 days after Matthew was found. This happened very quickly. This is one of the few cases where things were not drawn out. This was quick. Henderson was immediately charged with attempted first-degree murder, and the girlfriends were charged with accessories after the fact. Aaron McKinney was arrested, and investigators began interviews with him on October 9th. McKinney tells investigators that he and Henderson saw Shepard at Fireside. They went to the bathroom and hatched a plan to act as if they were gay to isolate and rob him. McKinney claimed that Matthew's sexual advances caused him to react in almost a self-defense capacity. Investigators believed that he was setting up what was called the gay panic defense early on. The gay panic defense is a legal strategy used by defendants in criminal cases to claim that they acted in a state of temporary insanity or diminished capacity due to an unwanted sexual advance, in this case, same-sex advance. This defense argues that the advance provoked the defendant into a violent reaction, often resulting in assault or murder. The rationale is that the advance caused such a shock or panic that it temporarily impaired the defendant's ability to reason and control their actions. Bullshit. As a woman, okay, can you imagine, ladies, can you imagine if every time a man approached us with unwanted sexual advances and grabbed our ass or put his hand up our skirt or grabbed our tits or wouldn't let us leave a room, or if every time a man did that and we didn't want him to, we were justified in killing him? I would be the world's most prolific serial killer if that was an out. If that was a justifiable response to someone giving you a sexual advance, that's insane. People get mad at women for calling the cops when someone beats them. But these men are like, he touched my leg and I lost my mind. Again, bullies. And they're always cowards. Because when it's 2 against 1 and it's late at night and it's a little guy and they don't think they're going to get caught. They're big, tough guys. They beat him to death. When they're in the hot seat, but he touched me and I was scared. McKinney also confessed in the form of a letter that he wrote to Russell Henderson while they were both waiting trial. I'm going to read parts of this letter. It's pretty long and egregious. And there are, and I'm going to skip over those words. I'll let you know where they are. But there's he uses repeated homophobic slurs. His language very much indicates what kind of crime this was for him. To me, his own language in this letter and then in court is extremely indicative to me that this was a hate crime. When people try to be like, no, it's not, it's something else, I'm like, I don't think so. We'll get to that more later, but I'm going to read parts of this to you. Russ, hey homeboy, what's popping over there? He's in jail, dude. When we go to court, if they try us together or separate, I want you to blame everything on me. I already told them that, but they should hear you say what I said, so this is what I told them, and he gives them exactly what he told the cops. Later in the letter, he says, I made you at gunpoint drive me to the fence, then I tied him up. After that, he mouthed off, so I hit him a few more times, and his homophobic slur ass died. After that, I pointed my gun at you and threatened your life if you told the police. That's all I got for now. I'm sure I'll think of more later. Russ, I don't think you can begin to understand how sorry I am that I got you and Chastity Paisley, into this mess. You're the best friend I've ever had and the only one who never turned on me or ratted me out. That means a lot to me. If you hate me for this, I understand, but if there's anything I can say or do, let me know, and I'll do anything for you, bro, no matter what it is. I'll write more I'll write more later, Holmes, and you can write back or yell at me by the door. Later, homie, Aaron. So this was actually taken into evidence as a written confession of Aaron taking the blame and proof that Matthew's sexuality was a factor in his death. Because he addresses in the letter, he touched me or he made an advance on me, whatever. He addresses all of that in the letter. He just admits to it. Again, he had already told investigators that, but now it's in writing. After this letter, Henderson made a plea deal with prosecutors. He pled guilty to the charges of first-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping, and in exchange to vacate the death penalty was sentenced to 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole. As of 2023, Henderson, now 47, remains at a medium security prison in Torrington, Wyoming. Aaron McKinney did go to trial. His defense initially offered the gay panic defense, but it was struck down by Judge Barton Voigt. Thank God, because that's preposterous. He was convicted of both first-degree kidnapping and murder and prepared to fight a death penalty case. This part is so moving to me. After he was found guilty, the Shepards, so Matthew's parents, spoke to McKinney's attorney. In the courthouse the following day, Judy Shepard says to Detective O'Malley, "The hate stops here." And the Shepards were able to facilitate McKinney getting the same agreement that Henderson did, 2 life sentences without parole, and he didn't have to fight a death penalty case. I'm so inspired and so moved by his mother. Judy said she just wanted it to be over. She didn't want her younger son to face another trial, and she wanted to protect her family. Aaron McKinney is still currently in prison in Tutwiler, Mississippi. Both Kristen Price and Chastity Paisley were charged as accessories after the fact to first-degree murder. They both accepted plea deals, agreeing to testify against McKinney and Henderson in exchange for reduced sentences. Kristen was given a 180-day sentence and served 60. Chastity served 6 months of an 18-month sentence, which, in my opinion, neither of those sentences are long enough. Even though they help police and stuff, that's not enough. So, I addressed this earlier, but in later years, there were claims that this wasn't a hate crime, that it was a drug deal gone bad. My brother actually asked me about this as I was researching. My brother is consistently keeping me honest, holding me accountable. Here's what I found. The only sites and sources I could find supporting this theory were very questionable and clearly biased conservative sites. Like, these would not be sites I would be willing to use as a reputable source because the bias is so extreme. And I couldn't find any reputable sources either nationally or internationally that took this view. But here's why I think that claiming this is a drug deal gone bad doesn't fit the evidence, and I think that it's a little bit of a cop-out, which I'll get into in a second. But number one, McKinney and Henderson themselves, even as recent as 2018, have said they targeted him because he was gay, and they reacted violently because he was gay. So, the 2 men who committed the murder have said it is because he was gay. If he was a straight man, he may never have been targeted at all to be robbed. much less. And if he was robbed, he wouldn't have touched McKinney's leg. And so he may have just been robbed and not murdered. So the murderers have said it was because he was gay. McKinney's own defense attempted to use the gay panic defense, and at no point in the trial was there a discussion of a drug deal. It's not in the court transcripts anywhere. The defense would be absolutely insane to not include that, as it's the difference between a premeditated kidnapping and murder and a situation of things got out of hand. The sentencing between a murder that is premeditated and not is huge. He would have the worst defense of all time to not use that if it were a factor. Number 3, I find McKinney's language particularly damning, both in his interviews and the letter, the gay slurs. He's very clearly very hateful and completely disgusted with someone who is a homosexual. Number 4, the coroner's report. So Wyoming Public Radio requested the autopsy report in 2018 under the Freedom of Information Act. Prior to that, the autopsy report had been sealed and it was never made public. Julie Heggie, the coroner at the time, along with law enforcement and the county attorney's office, had decided against mass distribution. They don't give a reason why. That's just what they decided. Cause of death was listed as repeated blunt force trauma to the head. Heggie noted in her report and in an interview in 2018, which was the first time that she had spoken about this case, that there was extensive bruising to his genitalia that had clearly also been the focus of an attack. For her, this, quote, brought up a lot of red flags to the fact that this was a hate crime. The bruising and damage to his genitalia were finger and hand shaped, and the coroner noted that this probably happened in the vehicle. It was not done by kicking, as some people thought. It was done with someone's hands. The report also showed that Matthew did have trace amounts of antidepressants and marijuana in his system. His alcohol level the night of the murder was not noted as very high. Toxicology also revealed there was no meth, cocaine, or opioids in his system. Later, there would be accusations that this was a meth deal. Meth stays in your hair for 99 days, and there was no traces of meth found in his system. So if Matthew had used meth or was using, he hadn't used it in at least 3 months. So McKinney and Henderson were reported to be regular meth users. There's no evidence that Matthew was, just from what I could find. No drugs were found in the truck. No drugs were found in the homes of McKinney or Henderson or on Matthew Shepard's person anywhere, even in trace amounts. So, fun fact about this coroner, just a little side quest. When there's a program in Wyoming called the Crime Victim Witness Program that usually covers the cost of a funeral of victims of violent crimes. They refused to cover the cost of Matthew Shepard's without explanation. We can probably guess why. And the coroner, Dr. Heggie, was so outraged that they wouldn't cover the cost that she covered it herself for the family. So she paid for Matthew's funeral. And in a 2018 interview, which is the first interview she ever gave, she said again, and this is again partly why I just think that the drug accusation doesn't have a lot of evidence behind it. She said, I'd like to throw out there that I think everybody knows this was a hate crime. I think they're lying to themselves if they think this was not a hate crime. Number 5, again, these are just reasons I don't think that the drug deal gone bad fits the evidence. Number 5 is the rage. So if you study criminal psychology, people like the behavioral analysis unit who study crime can tell a lot about a killer based on how they kill someone. Drug deals do go wrong, and drug is and has been a problem in Wyoming, right? So that's not outside of the realm of possibility. But say a drug deal goes wrong, but in the spur of a moment situation, you might kill someone, right? But you're gonna stab them or shoot them or hit them in the head with a pipe, and then maybe you'll hide the body, right? Because now you're like, shoot, I accidentally killed someone, I gotta hide the body. But the amount of rage exhibited here, he was beaten so badly they crushed his brainstem. And the attack on his genitals indicate that this is sexual in nature, it's passionate, and it's a rage-filled murder. The other thing is that people who murder someone on accident typically show signs of remorse. They bury the body. They cover the body. They pose it in a peaceful way. They don't hang it on a fence and display it. So if we were talking like Italian mafia hit, you would see like a display of some kind, but not some like rogue dudes at a bar. That just tells me they had no remorse. Number 6, all of the lead investigators, the prosecutors, and the coroner all believe this was a hate crime, so the people that were there. And number 7, there's no evidence of any kind that Matthew had met either of these two before the night of the murder. No connection whatsoever. And now, in spite of all that tragedy and loss and just senseless hate, here's a little bit of hope. So Russell Henderson, so he was the accomplice. He helped tie Matthew to the fence. He was not the person who beat him, but didn't stop it either. Russell is still in prison. I mean, he's going to be in prison for the rest of his life, which is sad because he was only 22 at the time, I believe. Russell Henderson later came out. He sent a letter to the Shepards apologizing for what he did. And he's done a couple of interviews where he said, I think about Matthew every day. And he's like, I think about how hateful I used to be. And he was like, I've had this opportunity that even though I can't get out of here, I can change my life and I can be better. And he has become a staunch advocate for laws that protect everyone. And he has become a huge supporter of legislation protecting gay rights. He's spoken out about it. And again, he's never getting out of jail. He's not going to get anything from this. He also volunteers with hospice prisoners, so prisoners that are dying from terminal illness. He works with several volunteer agencies within prisons, and he really, truly seems to have recognized how heinous the crime was, but also the senselessness of his own hate. And now he spends the majority of his time really trying to help and serve others. It's pretty awesome. If you have the time and you're interested, I would recommend just reading up on what Russell Henderson does now. It doesn't really seem that Aaron McKinney gives a shit. He has come out in later interviews as recent as 2023 saying, yeah, like, well, of course it was because he was gay. He touched me, he did this. But he just seems to be a hateful person. And I don't think if he hasn't dealt with that now, he's not going to deal with it ever. But I thought that Russell's story was particularly encouraging because I want to believe that for the most part, people can be redeemed. I want to believe that we can overcome prejudices or our own worldview or our own shortcomings, that we can learn. And I think that if a murderer who's in jail forever, again, he has nothing to gain by saying this, then I think that there's a little bit of hope for everybody. And I'm glad that he has the opportunity to spend the rest of his life helping people. The second little ray of hope is that when Matthew was murdered, there were some existing federal and state hate crime laws, but none of the federal laws and many of the state laws covered the gay community. Judy Shepard, Matthew's mother, became an outspoken activist for the LGBTQ rights and protection movement. Largely due to her effort, in 2009, President Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act into law. So for those of you that aren't familiar, James Byrd Jr., who was 49, was also murdered in 1998 in a racially motivated hate crime in Texas. 3 men, 2 of them who were open white supremacists and 1 who was a longtime associate of Byrd, who was a local black man, offered James a ride to town. He knew the one guy, didn't know the other 2. He decided to get in the truck, accepted the ride. They took him to a remote location. They beat him, peed on him, defecated on him, tied him to the back of the truck, and drug him until they severed his head and arm off against a culvert. And they dropped his torso off in front of a black church cemetery. Even in this instance, many people tried to claim that it wasn't a hate crime. They tried to blame drugs. James Byrd had no history of that. And George Bush Jr. declined to sign anti-hate crime laws into legislation because the men were caught and sentenced. But again, it was another situation where people tried to say, it's not that, it can't be. And I was like, things like this that are so blatantly hate crimes, like that, you have to do some mental gymnastics to say that that's not racially motivated. And in the last few years, and even as I was doing this research, I find myself so incredibly frustrated with people who will see something that is so blatant and be like, no, I can't hear you. It's not real. It's not a hate crime. It's not police brutality. It's not whatever. And I'm not saying, obviously every crime that happens to a gay person isn't a hate crime. You know what I mean? But there are hate crimes. And I was trying to wrap my initial reaction is to get angry at what I consider to be the willful ignorance of that. But when I was doing this research, I sat with it and I was like, okay, what do people gain by pretending that these crimes don't exist? Or that if they do, they're extremely rare? And it reminded me of my own journey with how I've changed my beliefs over time. If I acknowledge that this is a hate crime, against a gay person, or a hate crime against a black person, not only do I have to acknowledge the nature of that crime, I have to acknowledge the system that it makes it possible. And once you open that door, you have to address those core beliefs. You have to start addressing, well, maybe there are systems in place that aren't equally protecting people. Well, maybe, especially for like when things happen in these little towns, you have to look at your neighbor and be like, how many of us support this? How many of us are okay with this? It really challenges your worldview. And for many people, this is the worldview they've grown up with. Again, that passive and active prejudice. And by admitting that these things are real, sitting with them in empathy, choosing to see the victims as they are, which is victims, not to try to be like, well, they had a criminal background. It doesn't matter if you have a felony. It doesn't give the right to someone to kill you. You're still a person. But if we treat them as victims of these type of crimes, instead of making justifications for it, then we have to acknowledge the motivation behind the crime. Gave me a little bit more sympathy. Well, not sympathy, because I still think it's dumb, but it gave me a little bit more understanding towards why people get so defensive about these kind of crimes, even if they're not a participant or they don't know somebody that participated. It's really, I'm like, oh, like this challenges us to look at ourselves and to challenge our worldview. But this Hate Crimes Prevention Act is a significant piece of federal legislation because it addresses and combats hate crimes, and it expands hate crime law. So in 1969, the original federal hate crime law did not include crimes that were motivated by gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. This law changed that and included those protections. So the Shepards, after his death, began to receive a lot of financial support and decided together, according to Dennis, that, quote, this money should be used to benefit everybody, which is just like, that is just how these two beautiful people live, and I love and respect them for it. And they launched the Matthew Shepard Foundation on December 1st, Matthew's birthday, 1998. The foundation's goal was to raise awareness to gay issues, encourage diversity, education, and inspire compassion, understanding, and acceptance. And that's it for the crime story. This all happened very fast. This was one of the few episodes I've seen where this was wrapped up in a couple months. They did not waste time. And I got so emotional, and I cried a couple times during the episode and got emotional researching it. I think in big part because it reminded me of my own journey to tolerance. And I didn't actually plan on sharing any of this, but I'm going to. I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a very strict, rigid, white evangelical household. And I can look at it now and understand that I grew up around a lot of both passive and very active homophobia, racism, very much prejudice towards certain other religions, namely Islam. And I remember, I look back and I'm so deeply embarrassed about some things that I said and did as a teen and a young adult. And I really thought I was right. And I look back on things that I said and did that must have been so hurtful and so lacking in compassion to people's experience. One of the things that stood out to me as I was thinking about all of this was when I went to college, I had a Confederate flag keychain. My dad was a very big proponent of the Civil War was about states' rights. And I'm like, yeah, the right to own humans. But at the time, I really bought into that. I was really into the very staunch conservative movement that we see now, the conservative Christian nationalism. I was really bought into that. And I remember having that keychain on my backpack, and a very good friend of mine from Maine pulled me aside and he said, have you ever thought about how it makes Black people feel when you walk around with that? And he was so kind. And here's the thing, I'm from Wyoming. I had didn't really interact with black people ever because none of them lived there. They're smart enough to be like, it's cold up here, bitch. So I didn't have black friends. I didn't know anybody that was black. And he pulls me aside, and I had grown up in this bubble where everyone looks like me. Everyone follows the religion I followed. Everyone believes what I believe. I was in an echo chamber. And he pulled me aside and with so much love and like grace just asked me that question. And I'm sitting there like, man, if I was a black woman and I saw some white girl with this, I would be upset. And it really made me do a lot of my own research on, the Civil War and racial issues. It wasn't until my late 20s that I realized how much of a whitewashed racial history I've been taught. And it was that moment, that conversation around a keychain that started a shift for me. And one of the things that I encountered was that when political issues become people, it is very difficult to maintain your prejudice. That conversation and then friendships with these beautiful black human beings who are still great friends of mine, who are my favorite people in the world, understanding their experience, that I don't get to look them in the face and say, oh, well, that's not real because I've never experienced that. A police officer's never done that to me. I was like, wow, maybe I don't have the full picture. And then all of a sudden when it's your friends, when it's people when it's people who are so similar to you in many ways, and I was so blessed over the next few years to be in situations with people who showed me how narrow-minded I was and showed me that regardless of whatever I believed, that everyone deserves equal protection and equal opportunity. And my views on abortion changed when I was essentially helping a 12-year-old rape victim who had gotten raped by her stepfather for 3 years. And she'd been raped from the time she was 9. She got her period, he got her pregnant. And I'm watching this unfold and I'm like, this isn't right. Like, my views are so calloused and they're happening in a vacuum that I'm not taking into considerations people's lives. And really the last issue that really transformed for me was my view on homosexuality, because I grew up very much in the church of like, it's a sin, it's immoral, it's a choice, it's this, it's blah, blah, blah. And I used to parrot those things. And part of it, moving to New York and all of a sudden, again, the same issue I had when I was younger. I didn't know any black people. All of a sudden you're meeting gay people and they're fabulous and they're wonderful. And you start to hear their experiences and what they've been through. So many of them got thrown out of their homes. They were homeless. They were beaten. They were bullied. And you're like, wait a minute. These are people. These are consenting adults. And it called attention to my worldview where I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't just. This isn't right. Because even as staunch of a Christian as I was at the time, I believe in freedom of religion. I can't legislate my religion on other people. That's not right because that violates their freedom. And I'm so thankful for the roommates and the people that just opened my eyes to that a lot of these issues can be healed when we choose to see each other as people first. When, the gays become my neighbor, my roommate, my friend. And I think if we can anchor ourselves in humanity first, then what happens is all of a sudden, I can't just let injustice slide. I can't do that because this is my community now. And if people would be willing to set aside their hyper emotional responses, our knee-jerk reactions to these things, especially when we've grown up in certain environments, we can't control that. But if we would be willing to set those down, we would realize that we have so much more in common than we have in difference. And people, and even recently, Justice Clarence Thomas has talked about overturning the right for gay people to get married. But when you look at gay relationships are relationships. It's like they want to marry somebody they love the same way I want to marry somebody that I love. And if you're consenting adults and you're not breaking any laws, you should have the right to do that. And, you know, one of the things that I also learned, because I had been told my whole life that homosexuality is a choice and it's a sin against God, blah, 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 blah. And, I mean, I can tell you that I never chose to be straight. And when I got older and started dating, let me tell you that if I could make the pivot to date women, I would. I think that straight women are a true testament to sexuality is not a choice. But then what stood out to me is you hear these experiences, and it's everything from, I have clients that moved to New York in the 80s and 90s because it was one of the few places you could be safe. And gay people are the best roommates. Had several gay roommates that told me about their experiences. One of the things about humans is we tend to take the road of least resistance. And we tend to do things that don't cause us pain. So if this was a choice, there's not a lot of people that would choose it. Why would you choose discrimination, assault, like being thrown out of your own house, being rejected by your family, being written out of the will? People wouldn't choose that for themselves. And if they did, it would be very rare. The other thing is history. Gay people and trans people have existed for the extent of time that we have recorded history. Back when you would get killed if people found out. People hid their identities their entire lives. And I don't think that people would do that if it was a choice. And again, even in my own perspective, I'm like, man, if I could pivot, I surely would. And I think of people like Alan Turing who broke the Enigma code and basically saved Britain from Germany because they were kicking ass with their codes. They find out he's gay later. He saved the nation and they chemically castrate him. And you look through history and there's all these examples of such unnecessary cruelty. And I want to think that we can become a nation that doesn't hold on to that prejudice anymore. I'm someone who I'm very like a mind your business person. If someone's a consenting adult and they're not breaking any laws, let people be. I believe in choice. I believe in equal access to medical care and education. And equal access, equal opportunity does not mean equal outcome because you can't predict outcomes. But we're living in a time in our country where there's a lot of conversation around taking more rights away from people. And it's already happening to women. And there's conversations about taking gay people's rights to marry away. There's conversations around removing affirmative action protections and discrimination laws. And the only person that benefits is white people, specifically white men. It doesn't protect anyone else. And it's an enormous step back. And I tend to think in America, this is the last dying breath, right? People are afraid of the loss of power. They're afraid of change. But I'm hoping with this story, and even with my story, going from someone who was incredibly prejudiced, even though I didn't think I was, that you can change, that you can evaluate your worldview. And if your worldview has never been challenged, then you haven't gotten out enough. And that's one of the reasons I support travel. Travel as often and as frequently as you can. Because when you encounter others, people that look differently than you, that practice a different faith, they speak a different language, they love different people, they love different ways, those prejudices become impossible to hold on to. You just can't do it. And I just hope that encourages you, that there's hope. There is space for everyone. One of the women in the world that I respect the most is Muslim, and she is the kindest, most honest, intellectual, caring person I have ever met. And, I have a large community of Black friends now who are creative and beautiful and so incredibly strong. So strong what they face every day. And I have an amazing LGBTQ plus community who challenge me all the time to widen my perception, to stop putting people in boxes, to stop being shy around something that's unfamiliar. And I think that they challenge all of us to do that, to introduce something that's unfamiliar, that we don't have to follow the paradigms of the past forever. We can be different and we can be better. I hope that encourages you. I hope it inspires you. It really did for me. I find myself progressively more discouraged with legislation that's being passed in the U.S. And there's this feeling of hopelessness of like, what do we do? But I think that, like Matthew Shepard's parents, we all have the power to change things. And I think it really starts with loving your neighbor as yourself. And I had a conversation with someone yesterday or the day before where, we were talking about moving from the type of Christianity that's hateful and prejudicial to a newer understanding of our faith. And one of the things that has always been a turning point for me is that, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten son. There's no qualifier. Jesus didn't die for the people that were going to the tabernacle. He didn't die for the people that were white, or only the people that were Jewish, or only the people that were, it was everyone. No qualifier. And for me, if Christ can love everyone that much, then it's my job to try to love them that much. And sometimes on social media, I get comments of like, because I have progressively become more and more of an activist, particularly for women's rights, LGBTQ rights. And some people be like, well, you're not, like this XYZ doesn't affect you. Why do you care? Why are you so outspoken? And the reality is that I think that justice, true justice, is not just looking at a situation and saying, I want justice for me, or looking at a situation that happens like what happened to James Byrd saying, oh, I hope that never happens to me. It's how do I make sure that never happens to anyone? Justice is how do I make sure that this is accessible to everyone? And I was reminded of a poem that I want to read you because it just sums up to me like my personal belief system around activism and equal rights. And I think it's so important because we always believe it'll never happen to you, right? It'll never happen to me. It'll never happen to me. Even with, when the few years ago, I remember talking to people saying, hey, they're going to overturn Roe v. Wade. People like, no, they'll never do that. Now we're like, And now there's legislation on some of these red states about banning contraception. People are like, oh, they'll never do that. We always think that it won't be us until it is. And that's why it's important that we stand up for everyone and not just ourselves. But I wanted to read you this poem. So this poem was written by Pastor Martin Niemöller, and he was a pastor in early 1900s Germany. In the 1920s and the 1930s, he actually was a Nazi supporter. He supported radically right-wing political movements. It's important to remember that Nazi Germany was a Christian nationalist nation. It was 90% Christians, very conservative. The Nazi movement was a conservative movement. But after Hitler came to power in 1933, Niemöller began to speak out against Hitler's actions. And he spent the last 8 years of Nazi rule from 1937 to 1945 in Nazi prisons and concentration camps. And he wrote this poem that's part of the Holocaust Memorial that is just so powerful, and it's called First They Came. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Again, I hope that inspires you. I hope it challenges you. I know it does me. I'm constantly trying to make sure that I am trying to protect everyone and make the country better for everyone and not just myself. I'm going to take a few minutes because this episode has run long. It's been I've loved this episode. It's been just great researching it. And to me, it's inspired a lot of hope. But I want to talk about travel recommendations in Wyoming. So again, Wyoming is extremely rural. It's very beautiful. This is for your outdoorsy people. There are some events that I'll talk about. But winter sports, yes. Kayaking, canoeing, whitewater rafting, hiking, national parks. This is your vibe. Family vacations. This is your vibe, okay? So the number one, of course, is Yellowstone National Park, established in 1872, the first national park in the world. It's 2.2 million acres and sits on top of what's called the Yellowstone caldera, which is one of the largest active volcanic systems on Earth. Famous for its geothermal features coming from those volcanic features like Old Faithful and those hot springs I was telling you about. Those are they're literally so hot though that you can't get in them. Don't ever do that in Yellowstone. It will like burn your appendages off. There's obviously lots of wildlife, and the park was created to preserve the unique natural wonders and the ecosystem. I am such a supporter of conservation efforts. The other one, which is particularly beautiful, is Grand Teton National Park, which was established in 1929, expanded in 1950. It's named after the Grand Tetons, and the Tetons were the mountain range that I grew up seeing from the top of the ranch. Just so beautiful. The park's creation was actually significantly influenced by John D. Rockefeller Jr., who purchased and donated the land for preservation. This is like real mountains, and it is very hard to describe it to you. One of the things that stands out to me is when you go in this late spring, early summer, and you'll drive in, there's this mountain just sloping up ahead of you, and you can see the white cap, and there's pines coming down the side, and then it opens up into these fields of purple mountain flowers. Just fields. It's just so breathtaking. Beautiful places for mountaineering, hiking, wildlife viewing. And then there's Devil's Tower National Monument that I mentioned in the intro. Here's a picture of it. This will be on socials later this week and on YouTube, of course, for those of you that watch on YouTube. So this is the giant igneous rock that I was telling you about. That's the largest of its kind in the world. It kind of looks like a giant thumb, and it's got these huge striations down the side of it. There's a 2.5-mile hiking path at the base of it. Really beautiful. Devil's Tower was actually designated by Theodore Roosevelt in 1906 as the first national monument. So Wyoming has both the first state park and the first national monument. It's 1,267 feet high. You can still climb it, to my knowledge. So if you're a mountaineer or rock climber, you can still do that. It's got a lot of cultural and spiritual significance to the Native American tribes. It's really pretty. It's in a very rural area, but it's worth the drive. It's worth the visit. Very, very cool. And even if you haven't heard much of Wyoming or know anything about it, you've heard of Jackson Hole. And Jackson Hole is the valley between Teton and Gros Ventre mountain ranges. And it was originally, as the rest of Wyoming was, inhabited by Native Americans. It became a rendezvous point for fur trappers. So today it's a very vibrant town. It's beautiful, world-class skiing. Expensive. World-class skiing. It's unbelievable. Super close to Yellowstone and Grand Teton parks. And it's got this really beautiful historic town square. It is so worth the visit. And, it's one of those things. It's like Vail, Colorado. It's like, everybody goes to Vail. It's kind of worth it. You need to go at least once to both those places. Another cool and a little bit random place to visit is Wyoming Frontier Prison. So it's located in Rawlins, Wyoming, and it's known as Old Penn. It operated from 1901 to 1981, housed some of the most notorious criminals of the early 20th century. It housed people like William Carlisle, who was a serial train robber who escaped from the prison in 1919, Andrew Pixley, who was sentenced to death for killing a circuit court judge's children, and Butch Cassidy was inmate number 187. He served 18 months of a 2-year sentence here. But again, it's in Rawlins, Wyoming, and it's now a museum. So you can do guided tours, really cool insights into like the penal system of the 20th century. Really awesome. I love that kind of history, so. Couple other places if time is available. There's the Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area. This is like 120,000 acres, and it's just nature, but it's like beautiful, deep canyons, huge reservoirs, wildlife. And then there's the Hot Springs State Park, which is in Thermopolis. it's got the largest mineral hot spring known as the Big Spring. And the park was created to preserve these natural hot springs, which kind of occur everywhere. But this park, so if you want to go to like hot springs to bathe in, go to Hot Spring State Parks. There's bathhouses, colorful terraces. Like, this is your kind of, if you're looking for like hot spring spa day, this is the thing. And the last thing I want to mention, because it's the biggest event of the year in Wyoming, and it happens every year. It's what Wyoming is most famous for. It is the largest event of its kind in the world, and that is Cheyenne Frontier Days. It's the world's largest outdoor rodeo and Western celebration. So this was established in 1897. It's been going for over 100 years. Typically takes place the last full week of July going into August, and it's a blend of rodeo competitions, concerts, parades, cultural activities. Rodeo competitions are kind of the heart of the event. It happens all day. It's professional bull riders, bronc riders, barrel racers, team ropers from all over the world. Family and friends have competed in this. There's country concerts, not just country anymore, actually. It used to be just country concerts every night. Now they've got a mix. I know that Post Malone was there either last year or the year before. They've had hip-hop artists, country artists. George Strait was there a few years ago, the last time I was there. But it's every night. It's wonderful. There's parades. There's Western heritage. There's a lot of Native American heritage that gets celebrated. There's big dances. If you like to line dance or swing dance, all of that comes in. They build what's called Frontier Town, which is they essentially recreate an Old West setting. So there's saloons and shops and interactive exhibits. It allows you to kind of see what a frontier town would actually be like. There's carnival items. Sometimes there are actually carnival rides set up in different parts of Cheyenne. There's a place called Indian Village, which is Native American dancing, storytelling, crafts. You can get handmade jewelry and art from local various tribes, mostly from Wyoming, but they come in from the Dakotas and Colorado as well. There's free pancake breakfasts. It's a cool event. Like, I actually can't wait to go back. I need to be in Chicago at the end of July this year, but I'm hoping I can catch part of Frontier Days or go next year. If you're going to go to Wyoming for an event, go to that event. It's worth it. It's going to be crowded and it's wonderful and you'll enjoy it. And that is it for today's Highway to Hell episode. I am barely making my hour-and-a-half cutoff. I hope that you enjoyed learning about my home state, and I hope that this story gave you some hope. Whatever you need hope on, in your life. I know a lot of people are going through a lot of things. For me, it really gave me hope that I'm like, you know what? Things can always get better. I can help things get better. I can be better. And I hope that you take that throughout your week. And just a reminder that Highway to Hell is now going to be released on Wednesdays. It works so much better with my work schedule. So I'm just doing that to keep life easy for myself. And I'll see you next week on Highway to Hell.